Galactic Council executes human envoy. Earth announces extermination protocol. The screen went red before anyone in the room understood what they were seeing. I was standing in the operations center on the 14th floor of the Earth Coalition building when the feed from the council chamber cut through every channel at once. No warning, no countdown, just Elena Voss, kneeling on a marble floor 1,000 light-years away, surrounded by armed guards from 6 different species, while a council magistrate read out a verdict in a language our translators struggled to keep up with. My name is Daniel Kerr. I was her second in command. I should have been standing beside her. Instead, I was watching her die on a screen with 40 other officers who had gone completely silent. The charge against her was called cultural contamination. It was a phrase the council had never used before, not against any species, not in the 200 years since they had opened contact with the wider galaxy. They invented it that day, specifically for her, specifically for us. The real reason didn't need translating. Humanity had grown too fast, learned too fast, and asked too many uncomfortable questions about how the council really worked. Elena had spent 3 years trying to get Earth a permanent seat at the table. She had shaken hands with beings who breathed methane and beings who communicated in light patterns. She had memorized the etiquette of 11 different cultures so she would never cause offense. She had done everything right. None of it mattered. The magistrate finished speaking. Elena looked directly into the camera, not at the guards, not at the magistrate, straight into the lens, like she knew exactly who was watching on the other end. She didn't look afraid. She looked like she was trying to tell us something with her eyes, because she wasn't allowed to say it with her mouth. Then the feed ended. Nobody in the operations center moved for almost a full minute. I remember the sound of the ventilation system was the loudest thing in the room. Someone's coffee cup was still steaming on a desk, untouched. General Priya Nair, who ran coalition security out of that building, was the first to speak, and all she said was, "Get me a secure line to the assembly, now." I didn't sleep that night. I don't think anyone in that building did. We sat in front of monitors watching the news feeds from every continent, watching billions of people process the same footage we had just seen live. There was no rioting. That surprised me at the time. I expected anger in the streets, protests, chaos. What we got instead was quiet. A heavy, humming quiet, like the whole planet was holding its breath at the same time. I think part of me expected our government to issue an angry statement within the hour, strong words, condemnation, the kind of diplomatic outrage that fills news cycles and then fades away. That is what smaller nations used to do to each other back when Earth still had smaller nations. It's what I assumed the Coalition Assembly would do now, on a bigger stage, against a bigger opponent. They didn't say anything at all. For 6 hours, the official channels stayed dark. No press conference, no emergency broadcast, just silence from every government building on the planet, while every other species in council space filled that silence with their own noise, arguing about what humanity would do next, running odds in their own news feeds on whether Earth would apologize, retreat, or beg for mercy. I was in a corridor outside the security wing around 3 in the morning when a courier handed me a sealed data tablet, the kind reserved for classified transmissions that never touch the open network. I remember my hands were unsteady when I opened it, because I still had Elena's voice in my head from the last briefing call we'd shared 2 days earlier, when she told me she thought the tribunal was just theater and she'd be home within the week. The message on the tablet was 5 words long. Protocol Kessler-Omo is authorized. I had never heard those words before, not in 3 years working alongside Elena, not in any briefing, any drill, any classified folder I had ever been given clearance to open. Whatever it was, it existed above my clearance level, above the clearance of most of the people standing around me in that hallway. General Nair read the same message over my shoulder. She didn't gasp. She didn't react at all, not visibly. She just nodded slowly, like something she had been waiting years for had finally arrived, and said quietly, almost to herself, "So they finally pulled the trigger." I asked her what Kessler-O was. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look someone gives you right before they decide whether you're ready to know something. Then she said the only thing she was allowed to say. "It means the era of asking politely is over." I didn't understand what that meant yet, not fully. I only understood that something enormous had just been set in motion, something that had clearly been planned for a very long time, hidden inside systems and protocols that ordinary officers like me were never meant to see. Outside the window, the sky over the city was still dark, the kind of pre-dawn dark where the stars are the brightest thing visible. I thought about Elena kneeling on that marble floor, looking into the camera like she was trying to warn us about something. I wondered if she knew this was coming. I wondered if this was exactly what she'd been trying to tell us, with her eyes in those last seconds before the feed cut out. By sunrise, ships that had been sitting quietly in orbital docks for years, ships most of us assumed were just cargo haulers or old exploration vessels, began moving. I watched the tracking boards in the operations center light up one after another, dozens of contacts changing status from dormant to active, all across the solar system, all within the same 20-minute window. It was too coordinated to be a coincidence. It was too fast to be a reaction. It looked, more than anything, like the flipping of a switch that had been wired and waiting for years. General Nair finally addressed the room around 6 in the morning. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because every single person in that operations center was already listening as hard as they possibly could. "What you saw last night," she said, "was not a failure of diplomacy. It was the final test of it, and we failed it exactly the way we were always going to fail it, because it was never a test we were meant to pass." She let that sit in the room for a moment. For years, this organization has operated on the assumption that patience and good faith would eventually earn humanity a fair place among the stars. That assumption ended last night, on a marble floor, in front of a camera that was never supposed to show us what it showed us. Someone near the back of the room asked what came next. I remember the question hanging in the air, because nobody, not even the general, seemed fully ready to answer it out loud yet. "What comes next," she finally said, "is not a war. Wars are fought over land, or resources, or pride. What comes next is something the Council has never faced before, because no species foolish enough to provoke it ever survived long enough to describe it to the others." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to, not yet. Within hours, official word came down from the assembly itself, not through the usual channels of press releases and spokespeople, but through a single unified statement broadcast simultaneously to every device on the planet, and, more importantly, to every relay station humanity had access to across Council space. I watched it from the operations center with the rest of my unit, all of us crowded around the same screen that had shown us Elena's execution less than 24 hours earlier. The Assembly's chief coordinator appeared on screen, an older woman named Grace Farrow, someone I had seen in briefings before, but never in a moment like this. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. That gentleness was somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been. "Yesterday," she said, "the Galactic Council executed a representative of Earth for the crime of representing Earth too well. They did this publicly, deliberately, and without any process that resembled justice, because they believed humanity had no way to respond that would matter to them." She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle across the entire listening galaxy. They were wrong. There was no anger in her voice. That was the part that stayed with me the longest. She wasn't threatening anyone, the way an angry person threatens someone. She was simply stating a fact, the way you might describe the weather, or the time of day. Effective immediately, Earth is enacting what our own people will come to know as the Extermination Protocol. I want to be clear about what that name does and does not mean, because I suspect many listening tonight, on this world and many others, will misunderstand it on purpose. She looked directly into the camera, the same way Elena had the night before, and for a moment I felt like I was watching the same message continued from a different mouth. This is not the extermination of a people. It is the extermination of an idea, the idea that a species can be punished for growing, punished for asking questions, punished for existing without permission from those who arrived earlier. That idea dies today. Whatever it costs to bury it, we intend to pay. The broadcast ended there, less than 2 minutes long, no further explanation offered. I remember looking around the operations center and seeing the same expression on every face. Not fear exactly, something closer to recognition, like a fact everyone had known was coming but had never quite let themselves believe. General Nair was already moving toward the command corridor before the broadcast even finished, calling names over her shoulder, mine among them. Care, you're with me. Whatever comes next, you're going to want to see it from the inside, not from a screen. I followed her down the corridor, past officers running in every direction, past sealed doors opening for the first time in years, into a part of the building I had never been cleared to enter before that morning. I didn't know yet what protocol Kessler Oga actually involved, or what price Grace Farrow's words would truly demand of everyone listening, human and otherwise. I only knew that whatever quiet, patient version of humanity the galaxy had believed it was dealing with for the last 3 years, that version had just died on a marble floor along with Elena Voss. And something else, something the Council had never planned for and never truly understood, was about to take its place. General Nair led me through 3 separate checkpoints before we reached a room I didn't even know existed inside a building I had worked in for 2 years. The walls were lined with old paper files, actual paper, something almost nobody used anymore, sitting beside servers humming quietly in the corner. It felt like stepping into a different decade. "Sit down, Kerr," she said, gesturing to a chair across from a long table. "You're about to learn things that most of the people out there running around in a panic will never be told. I need you calm when you hear it." I sat. My hands were still not quite steady, but I nodded anyway. "You worked with Elena for 3 years," she said. "You saw the diplomacy, the handshakes, the treaties, the careful language. What you didn't see was the other half of her job." I frowned. There was another half? "Elena wasn't just a negotiator," Nair said. "She was part of a very small group inside the Coalition who understood something the rest of the galaxy has never had to understand about us. Every other species that ever joined the Council arrived with a single government, a single fleet, a single point of command that could be threatened, bribed, or broken, and the whole species would fall in line." She tapped the table twice, like she was marking a point on an invisible map. "Humanity never had that. We spent our entire history as a species without a single unified anything. Different nations, different militaries, different economies, all competing, all overlapping, none of them ever fully trusting the others enough to hand over total control. For most of our history, that was our greatest weakness. It's why we fought each other for thousands of years instead of growing together. But it also means," I said slowly, starting to understand, "there's no single point to attack." Nair almost smiled. It was the first expression close to warmth I'd seen from her since the execution. "Exactly. When the Coalition Assembly formed, the smartest thing we ever did was refuse to become one single fused authority the way outside observers expected us to. We kept the redundancy. Different regions still maintain their own forces, their own production capacity, their own command structures, all loosely tied together under the Assembly, but never so tightly that removing one piece removes the whole. The Council studied us for years and never understood why we didn't centralize the way every other species does. They assumed it was inefficiency, it was insurance." I thought about that for a moment. So Elena's execution was supposed to send a message to our leadership, a warning that could make the rest of us fall in line. "Yes," Nair said. "Because that's how it works with every other species in Council space. Remove the head, and the body stops moving. They executed Elena, expecting fear to travel upward through our chain of command and freeze us in place, the same way it would freeze any other species they've dealt with before." But we don't have a head, I said. We have thousands of heads, Nair replied, and every single one of them just watched the same broadcast you did. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin folder, sliding it across the table toward me. Inside were technical schematics I didn't fully understand, star charts marked with symbols I'd never seen in any briefing, and a short summary page labeled Kessler-Oma, Overview, Level 7 Clearance Required. "You're cleared for this now," she said, "because you're about to be part of implementing it." I opened the summary page. The words on it were simple, almost deceptively so, considering the scale of what they described. Kessler-Oma is not a war plan in the traditional sense. It does not seek territorial conquest, occupation, or the destruction of any council member species as a whole. It targets infrastructure, projection capability, and the specific mechanisms by which the council and its most aggressive members have historically enforced compliance among weaker species. Its purpose is not victory. Its purpose is deterrence through demonstrated capability, applied with precision, until continued conflict becomes more costly to the Council than any possible gain. I read it twice before looking up at Nair. This isn't just a response to Elena's execution. This has been planned for years. Longer than you'd believe, she said. Ever since the first contact reports came back, describing how the Council actually treats species weaker than itself. We didn't know when it would be triggered, or what the spark would be, but we always knew there would eventually be a moment where diplomacy stopped working and something else had to be ready to take its place. And Elena knew this, I said quietly. She knew, and she still went to that tribunal. Nair's expression softened, just slightly. Elena volunteered for that posting, knowing exactly what the risk was. She believed, right up until the end, that there was still a chance to avoid this outcome. She wasn't naive, Kerr. She understood the odds better than almost anyone alive. She simply believed the attempt was worth making, because the alternative meant assuming the worst about people before giving them a real chance to prove otherwise. I sat with that for a long moment, thinking about every conversation Elena and I had shared over 3 years, every late-night briefing, every small joke she made to ease the tension before a difficult meeting. She had known, on some level, that this might be exactly how her story ended, and she had walked into that chamber anyway. So what happens now? I asked. Practically, what does Kessler-Ovo actually look like in motion? Nair stood and walked to a wall display, activating it with a touch. A map of Council space appeared, vast and sprawling, dotted with hundreds of marked locations, some blinking amber, some blinking red. The amber sites are logistics hubs, she said. Fuel depots, shipyards, communication relays, the infrastructure the Council and its allied fleets depend on to project force against weaker species. The red sites are command and control centers, places where decisions get made about how that force gets used. We're going to attack all of these? Not all at once, and not the way you're imagining, Nair said. This isn't about overwhelming force in a single strike. It's about precision, patience, and making sure every action we take can be clearly traced back to a specific cause. Every target selected under Kessler-Oma exists because it has been directly involved, at some point, in enforcing Council policy against a weaker species through threat or force. This is not indiscriminate. It never will be. And if it doesn't work, if the Council responds with everything they have? Nair turned back to me, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something like genuine uncertainty cross her face before it disappeared again behind her usual composure. Then we find out whether 3 centuries of careful, quiet preparation was enough, she said. But I'll tell you this, Kerr, the Council has never fought an opponent that doesn't fear losing its capital, because it doesn't have one single capital to lose. They've never fought an opponent that can absorb losing an entire fleet without losing its ability to fight, because our production isn't centralized in one place either. Every assumption they've built their entire military doctrine around simply doesn't apply to us. I looked back down at the folder in my hands, at the quiet, clinical language describing something that was about to reshape the galaxy. It didn't read like the plans of people eager for war. It read like the plans of people who had hoped, for years, that they would never have to use it, and had prepared anyway, just in case hope wasn't enough. "There's something else you should understand," Nair said, "before we go any further. HFY isn't just a military protocol. It's also a diplomatic one, running in parallel, while our forces begin dismantling the infrastructure that allows the Council to project power against weaker species. Our diplomatic corps will be reaching out directly to every species the Council has historically suppressed or controlled. Species who have never had the chance to say no to Council demands, because they never had the leverage to make that no mean anything. You're trying to build alliances in the middle of a fight. We're trying to make it clear that this was never about Earth seeking power for itself," Nair said. "If the only thing that changes is which species sits at the top of the same broken system, we will have accomplished nothing worth the cost. The goal was never to replace the Council. The goal is to make sure no single body, human or otherwise, can ever again execute someone for the crime of asking to be treated fairly." I thought about the species we'd encountered over the past 3 years, some cautious, some outright hostile, a few genuinely curious about humanity in a way that felt almost hopeful. I wondered how many of them had been waiting quietly, for years, for someone strong enough to make the first move against a council they were too afraid to challenge on their own. "When do we start?" I asked. Nair checked the time display on the wall. "We already have. The first strikes against the amber sites began 19 minutes ago, time to launch the moment the Assembly's broadcast finished. By the time most people on Earth wake up tomorrow morning, 3 Council shipyards will no longer be operational, and every remaining shipyard within range will know it could be next." I felt something settle in my chest that was not quite fear and not quite relief. It was closer to weight. The specific weight of finally understanding the true size of what I had been pulled into. "There's one more thing," Nair said, more quietly now. "Elena's last transmission before the tribunal wasn't fully public. There was a private component sent directly to this office that never made it to the broadcast feeds." She pulled a small audio device from the folder and set it on the table between us. "I think you should hear it before we go any further." "I think she would have wanted you to." I stared at the device for a long moment before reaching out and pressing it to play, bracing myself for the sound of Elena's voice one final time, not knowing yet how much that recording would shape everything that came after. The recording started with a soft click, then a moment of static, then Elena's voice filled the small room, steady and calm in a way that made my throat tighten immediately. "If you're hearing this, Daniel, it means the tribunal went the way I expected it to go, and I want you to know that I am not afraid, and I need you to not be afraid either, because fear is exactly what they are counting on." I closed my eyes and listened. I've spent 3 years trying to convince myself that patience would work, that if we simply gave the Council enough time and enough good faith, they would eventually see us as equals instead of a problem to be managed. I was wrong about that, and I think some part of me knew I was wrong long before I admitted it out loud. But I want to be clear about something, because I know how this will be spread across every news feed on Earth once it happens. My death is not a tragedy to be avenged, it is a door being opened. Use it well. There was a pause in the recording, just long enough that I thought it might have ended, before her voice continued. "Tell General Nair that the 7th clause was correct. Tell her I said that exactly. She'll know what it means." The recording ended there. Nair was already writing something down when I opened my eyes, her expression unreadable. "What does that mean?" I asked. "The 7th clause. It means she believed, right up until the moment they took her into that chamber, that HFY should proceed exactly as designed, without modification, without hesitation, and without mercy for the specific individuals responsible for what was about to happen to her." Nair set down her pen. "There was debate, before she left for the tribunal, about whether the protocol's more aggressive elements should be softened if things went badly for her personally. Elena argued against that. She said, if it came to this, we should not let her death change the calculation in either direction. Not softer because of grief. Not harsher because of anger. Exactly as planned, because the plan was built on reasoning, not emotion. I didn't know what to say to that. It felt impossibly disciplined, the idea that someone facing their own end could think that clearly about strategy, instead of survival, instead of fear. She was the best of us, Nair said quietly, and for a moment the general sounded less like a commanding officer and more like someone who had lost a friend. Then the moment passed, and she straightened, the composure returning to her posture like a door closing. Which is exactly why we owe it to her to execute this correctly. Over the following days, I watched the shape of Kessler-Omo unfold from the inside, piece by piece, briefing by briefing. It was nothing like the wars I had read about in history archives, the kind fought over centuries between nations on Earth before the coalition unified us. There was no massed invasion fleet, no single dramatic battle meant to decide everything at once. Instead, it looked more like a slow, deliberate unraveling, precise strikes against specific targets, each one chosen not for maximum destruction, but for maximum disruption to the systems that allowed the Council to project power over weaker species. 3 shipyards became 5 within the first week. Communication relays that had allowed the Council's enforcement fleets to coordinate rapid response across their territory began going dark, not destroyed outright, but disabled in ways that would take considerable time and resources to repair. Fuel depots that supplied patrol fleets sent to intimidate smaller species into compliance stopped functioning entirely. Every strike came with a public statement, released simultaneously across every available channel, explaining exactly why that specific target had been chosen and what history connected it to enforcement actions against species who had no ability to defend themselves. It was strange watching a war being fought with that much explanation attached to it. I mentioned that to Nair during one of our late briefings, and she nodded like she'd expected the observation. "That's deliberate," she said. "We are not hiding what we're doing or why we're doing it, because the moment we start hiding our reasoning, we become exactly the kind of power we're trying to dismantle. Every target selection is documented. Every justification is public. If we're wrong about something, the whole galaxy will know it just as quickly as if we're right." I asked her about the reaction from other species, the ones who weren't directly part of the Council leadership, but existed somewhere in the vast web of smaller worlds under Council influence. She pulled up a summary screen showing incoming transmissions from dozens of different systems, more arriving every hour. "Some are terrified," she said. "They've spent generations being told that challenging the Council leads to ruin. And now they're watching a species that's barely 2 centuries old, proving that assumption wrong in real time. Fear like that doesn't disappear overnight, even when it's fear of the wrong thing." "And the others?" "The others are asking questions they've never been allowed to ask out loud before," Nair said. "We've received formal contact requests from 11 different systems in the past 3 days alone, more than we received in the previous 3 years combined. Some of them are cautious, testing the waters, trying to figure out if this is a genuine shift or just a temporary disruption that the Council will eventually crush and things will go back to how they were. Can we blame them for being cautious?" "No," she said simply. "We can't. Trust isn't something you demand from people who have spent generations learning that trusting the wrong power gets you destroyed. We have to earn it, the same slow way we're earning everything else in this fight." One of those contact requests came from a species called the Ithran, small aquatic beings from a world 3 jumps outside Council core territory, a species that had been under strict Council oversight for nearly 100 years after a resource dispute left them without the fleet capacity to resist Council terms. Their transmission was cautious, formal, careful not to commit to anything too openly, but it was the first time in a century they had communicated with anyone outside official council channels without prior authorization. I sat in on the response briefing when our diplomatic corps drafted their reply. It wasn't a promise of protection, and it wasn't a demand for allegiance. It was simpler than that. It was an offer to listen, an invitation to speak freely, for the first time in 100 years, with no requirement attached to it beyond honesty. Watching that exchange happen, I started to understand something about Kessler-Oma that the technical briefings hadn't fully captured. The military strikes were the visible part, the part that filled the news feeds and dominated every conversation happening across the coalition. But the quieter work happening alongside it, the careful outreach to species who had spent generations afraid to speak, felt like it might end up mattering more in the long run. Not everyone within the coalition agreed with that approach. I sat through one particularly tense meeting where a regional commander named Adrian Cole argued that the diplomatic outreach was moving too cautiously, that species who had been oppressed for a century deserved a stronger, faster commitment of support rather than careful, measured conversations. "We're not trying to build an empire to replace theirs," Nair told him, her patience visibly thinning by the end of the exchange. "If our first act as a rising power is to make promises we can't guarantee, to species desperate enough to believe anything that sounds like hope, we will have proven every cynical assumption the Council has ever made about ambitious young species correct." Cole wasn't fully convinced, and I understood his frustration, even if I agreed more with Nair's caution. There was something deeply uncomfortable about watching species suffer under a system we now had the power to challenge, while our own leadership insisted on moving carefully instead of rushing to help everyone at once. I didn't have a clean answer for that discomfort. I don't think anyone in that room did. The Council's official response came 9 days after Elena's execution, delivered not through the calm, measured tone Grace Farrow had used, but through something closer to open fury. Their spokesperson, a tall, sharp-featured being from one of the founding member species, appeared on every available channel across Council space, condemning humanity's actions as an act of terrorism against lawful galactic governance. I watched the broadcast from the operations center, surrounded by officers who had grown noticeably calmer over the past week, less shaken, more focused. The Council spokesperson demanded immediate cessation of all hostile action, threatened unspecified consequences if Earth did not comply within a set time frame, and insisted that the execution of Elena Voss had been a lawful judicial proceeding, conducted according to established Council precedent. "They're not even trying to explain the precedent," one of the junior officers near me muttered, "because there isn't one." That was true. In the days following the broadcast, our research teams had combed through every available record of Council judicial proceedings going back over a century, and found no prior instance of a diplomatic envoy from any species being executed for a charge as vague and undefined as cultural contamination. Elena's tribunal wasn't an application of existing law, it was the invention of new law, created specifically to justify a decision that had already been made before the proceeding even began. We released that research publicly, alongside a direct response to the Council's demand for cessation. Grace Farrow appeared again, this time with a simpler, sharper message than before. "You have asked us to cease hostile action," she said. "We are willing to discuss exactly that, under one condition: full transparency regarding the judicial process used against Ambassador Voss, public acknowledgement of the absence of legal precedent for her execution, and the establishment of an independent tribunal with representation from species outside Council leadership to review any future accusations against member envoys. Agree to these terms, and hostile action ceases immediately. Refuse, and you will learn exactly how patient we are capable of being." The Council did not respond to that offer. Not that day, not the next. Their silence stretched on for nearly 2 weeks, during which Kessler O continued its slow, methodical work across their territory, dismantling one enforcement mechanism after another, each strike accompanied by the same public justification, the same careful restraint, the same refusal to escalate beyond what the specific circumstances required. It was during that silence that I began to understand what Nair had meant, weeks earlier, when she said the Council had never fought an opponent that didn't fear losing everything at once. Every strike we conducted was recoverable, survivable, one piece of a much larger structure that could absorb losses and continue functioning. Every strike the Council might consider against us in return would be aimed at a target that, by design, was never irreplaceable, never the single point that could end the effort entirely. I didn't know yet how much that silence would cost, on both sides, before it finally broke. I only knew that somewhere in that silence the Council was learning, slowly and painfully, that the species they had executed an envoy to intimidate had never actually needed a single leader to keep moving forward. 3 weeks after Elena's execution, I received new orders. I was being reassigned from the Operations Center to a joint task force operating under Kessler Oga directly, attached to a mixed fleet group under the command of Captain Owen Blake, tasked with disrupting a Council enforcement corridor that had, for the past decade, been used to intimidate a cluster of smaller systems into compliance with Council trade terms. I hadn't expected to leave the Operations Center. I told Nair as much when she informed me of the transfer. You spent 3 years understanding how the Council thinks, from the diplomatic side, she said. Now you're going to understand how they operate from the other side. We need people in the field who understand why we're doing this, not just people who know how to follow strike coordinates. I reported to the transport vessel Meridian 2 days later, joining a crew of nearly 200, a mix of career military officers, former diplomatic staff like myself, and a handful of volunteers from other departments who had specifically requested reassignment into Kessler Omo operations after watching the broadcast of Elena's execution. There was a specific kind of quiet determination among that crew, different from the panic I'd expected. Nobody talked about the execution directly, not often, but it was there in the background of almost every conversation, the reason everyone had chosen to be exactly where they were. Captain Blake briefed us on our first mission personally, standing in front of a star chart showing the enforcement corridor we were meant to disrupt, a chain of small outposts and patrol routes that the Council used to threaten 3 neighboring systems into continued compliance with trade terms that heavily favored Council interests. Our target isn't the systems themselves, Blake explained. It's the patrol infrastructure that makes non-compliance dangerous for them. Communication relays, supply caches, the small outposts that let Council enforcement ships respond quickly to any sign of resistance. We disable those, and for the first time in a decade, those 3 systems get to make their own choices without an armed response arriving within hours. Someone near the back asked the obvious question. What happens to the personnel stationed at those outposts? We give them the chance to leave first, Blake said. Every outpost gets a warning transmission before we act, enough time to evacuate. This isn't about casualties, it never has been. It's about removing capability, not people. I appreciated that clarity, even as I understood how difficult it would be to maintain in practice, once things inevitably didn't go exactly according to plan. Our first operation went almost exactly as briefed. We arrived at the outer edge of the enforcement corridor, transmitted our warning to the first outpost, and watched their personnel evacuate aboard 2 small transport ships within the allotted window. Our strike teams disabled the outpost's communication and weapons systems with minimal resistance, and within 6 hours, we had moved on to the second target in the corridor. The third target didn't go as smoothly. The outpost commander, rather than evacuating, chose to hold position and activate a distress signal aimed at a Council patrol fleet stationed 2 systems away, hoping to buy enough time for reinforcement to arrive before we could complete our operation. Blake made the call to proceed anyway, accelerating our timeline, disabling the outpost systems before the patrol fleet could arrive, but the decision meant less caution than usual, and during the operation, one of our strike teams was caught in defensive fire from the outpost's automated systems. 2 of our people were injured. Nobody died, but it was the first time since I'd joined the task force that Kessler Oma felt less like a carefully managed demonstration and more like an actual fight, with actual costs, happening to actual people I had shared meals with just days earlier. I sat with one of the injured crew members, a young technician named Lena Osei, in the medical bay that evening, while she recovered from a fractured arm sustained during an emergency evacuation from the strike zone. "I keep thinking about what General Nair said," she told me quietly. "About how this isn't a war fought to win. It's a war fought to make the cost of continuing unbearable for the other side. But somebody still had to pay that cost today. It just happened to be me, instead of them this time." I didn't have a good answer for her. I still don't think I do. The careful, precise language used in every briefing, every public statement, every justification released alongside each strike was true as far as it went, but it didn't erase the reality that precision and restraint didn't mean nobody got hurt. It only meant fewer people got hurt than might have otherwise, which was a comfort that felt thin when you were the one sitting in the medical bay with a fractured arm. 2 days after that operation, the Council patrol fleet that had been summoned by the outpost distress signal finally arrived, 3 systems too late to prevent our objective, but early enough to intercept the Meridian and 2 escort vessels as we withdrew toward the edge of the corridor. It was the first direct engagement between our forces and a full Council patrol fleet since Kessler Omo began. I was in the operations deck when the contact alert sounded, watching the tactical display fill with unfamiliar ship signatures, 5 vessels against our 3. Captain Blake's voice stayed level as he issued orders, coordinating our escort vessels into a formation designed less for aggressive engagement and more for controlled, defensive withdrawal. "We're not here to win a fleet battle," Blake said over the comm, loud enough for the whole deck to hear. "We're here to get our people home. Evasive maneuvers, defensive fire only, and get us to the jump point." What followed was nothing like the dramatic battles I'd read about in old historical archives. It was tense, cramped, and disorienting, full of sharp maneuvers and defensive countermeasures rather than prolonged direct confrontation. Our ships were faster and more maneuverable than the Council patrol vessels, built with technology our engineers had spent years refining specifically for this kind of asymmetric engagement, designed to avoid direct confrontation whenever possible rather than seek it out. We reached the jump point 11 minutes after the engagement began, all 3 of our vessels intact, minor damage sustained but no serious injuries beyond what Lena had already suffered days earlier. The Council patrol fleet, without the speed to pursue us through the jump, was forced to break off. It wasn't a victory in any traditional sense. We hadn't destroyed anything, hadn't proven superior firepower, hadn't won a decisive engagement that would appear as a triumphant headline back on Earth. But we had demonstrated something the Council patrol commander would now have to report back through their own chain of command, something that would ripple outward through every subsequent decision the Council made about how to respond to Kessler Omo operations. We had engaged a full patrol fleet and simply chosen not to lose. Over the following month, similar reports began accumulating across every sector where Kessler Omo operations were active. Outposts disabled with minimal casualties. Patrol fleets engaged and evaded rather than decisively defeated. Infrastructure dismantled faster than the Council could repair it, spread across too wide an area for their existing forces to adequately defend all at once. The psychological effect of that pattern became apparent gradually through the tone of intercepted Council communications, through the increasingly cautious behavior of remaining patrol fleets, through the growing number of contact requests arriving from smaller systems who had spent years watching the Council's authority from a position of fear and were now watching that authority visibly strain under pressure it had never been designed to withstand. I received a message from General Nair roughly 6 weeks into my assignment aboard the Meridian, informing me that the Ithran, the aquatic species who had first reached out cautiously weeks earlier, had formally requested a defense cooperation agreement with the Coalition, the first such formal agreement any outside species had signed with Earth since Kessler-Oma began. It wasn't the last. Within the following 2 weeks, 4 additional systems submitted similar requests, each one a small crack forming in the wide, unified front the Council had always presented to the rest of the galaxy. Some of these systems were driven by genuine hope that a different kind of galactic order might finally be possible. Others, I suspected, were simply making a calculated bet on which side was more likely to still hold power a year from now. Captain Blake called me into his quarters during that same stretch of weeks, wanting my perspective as someone with diplomatic background on how to handle the growing number of contact requests arriving directly at our task force level, rather than through official coalition channels back on Earth. "They're reaching out to us specifically," he said, "because we're the ones visibly disrupting the corridor that's been threatening them for a decade. They don't fully trust distant leadership they've never seen in person. They trust what they can observe directly." "That's dangerous," I said. "If every task force starts making its own independent commitments to systems reaching out locally, we lose the coordination that's kept this whole effort from spiraling into chaos." Blake nodded slowly. "Which is exactly why I wanted your read on it, before I respond to any of them myself. We need a consistent message across every task force, something local commanders can offer, without overstepping into promises the Coalition as a whole can't guarantee." We spent that evening drafting a standard response protocol together, something simple enough to be trusted quickly, but honest enough to avoid the kind of over-promising Nair had warned against weeks earlier back on Earth. It wasn't glamorous work, nothing that would ever appear in the history archives the way the fleet engagement would. But sitting there, working through careful, deliberate language meant to build trust rather than dependency, I understood something about this fight that I hadn't fully grasped from inside the operations center back home. The military strikes were breaking the Council's ability to enforce its will through fear. But it was these small, careful conversations, happening in captains' quarters and diplomatic offices across dozens of task forces simultaneously, that would determine what actually replaced that fear once it was gone. Elena had understood that, I realized. It was why her final message hadn't asked for revenge. It was why she'd insisted the plan proceed exactly as designed, without anger reshaping it into something crueler than it needed to be. She had known, somehow, that the hardest part of this fight was never going to be the strikes themselves. It was going to be everything that came after them. By the 4th month of Kessler-Oma, the Council's position had changed in ways that even I, watching from aboard the Meridian, could measure without needing a formal briefing to explain it. Patrol fleets that once moved freely through contested corridors now traveled in larger, more cautious groups, stretched thin, trying to cover territory that had once been secured by fear alone. Communication traffic intercepted by our analysts showed growing friction between different member species within the Council itself, arguments over resource allocation, over which fleets should bear the cost of continued enforcement, over whether the entire approach toward Earth had been a catastrophic miscalculation from the very beginning. 7 systems had now signed formal cooperation agreements with the Coalition, each one negotiated with the same careful restraint General Nair had insisted on from the first week, and I had come to understand that restraint as something more than caution. It was proof, offered again and again, that Earth wasn't simply trying to become a new version of the power it was dismantling. I was recalled to Earth near the start of the 5th month, along with Captain Blake and several other task force commanders, for a briefing that Nair described only as urgent, without further detail through official channels. I assumed it meant an escalation, some new Council offensive we needed to prepare for. I wasn't prepared for what actually awaited us. The Council had requested a ceasefire, I sat in the same briefing room where Nair had first shown me the Kessler-Ome summary months earlier, surrounded now by dozens of officers and diplomats gathered from across the entire operation, all of us listening as Grace Farrow explained what had arrived through a previously unused emergency channel 3 days earlier. The request came through a neutral relay species, not directly from Council leadership, Farrow explained. They're asking for a formal negotiation, framed as mutual de-escalation, though I think we all understand what 4 months of sustained pressure has actually done to their position. Do we trust it? Someone near the front asked. We don't trust it blindly, Farrow said, but we don't dismiss it either. This is exactly the moment Kessler-Ome was designed to produce. The question now is what we do with it. The negotiation, when it finally happened 3 weeks later, took place not in the Grand Council chamber where Elena had been executed, but in a smaller, more neutral venue on a station maintained by one of the relay species who had agreed to host the talks. I was included in the delegation, not as a lead negotiator, but as someone with direct field experience under Kessler-Ome, there to answer questions about the operational reality of what our forces had accomplished, if any arose during the discussions. I remember stepping onto that station and feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and disbelief, the same emotions I'd carried since watching Elena's execution on a screen in the operations center 5 months earlier, now finally arriving somewhere that felt like it might actually matter. The Council's delegation arrived with visibly less confidence than I remembered from earlier broadcasts. Their spokesperson was different from the one who had condemned us so fiercely months before, replaced by someone with a noticeably more measured tone, someone clearly selected for their ability to negotiate rather than posture. Grace Farrow opened the discussion, and her demands hadn't changed from the ones she'd offered months earlier, back when the Council had simply ignored them in silence. Full transparency regarding Elena's tribunal, public acknowledgement that no legal precedent existed for her execution, an independent review process with representation from species outside Council leadership for any future accusations brought against member envoys. But there was a fourth demand now, one that hadn't existed in the original offer, added sometime during those 5 months of careful, deliberate strikes and quiet diplomatic outreach. Any species currently under Council enforcement agreements, obtained through threat of force rather than genuine consent, must be given the opportunity to renegotiate those agreements freely, without penalty for choosing differently than before. The Council delegation objected immediately, arguing that such a demand would destabilize agreements spanning decades, affecting dozens of member relationships across their entire territory. The negotiations stretched across 4 difficult days, full of the kind of careful, exhausting back and forth that I imagine defined most of Elena's work during her 3 years as an envoy, work I had only ever seen the surface of before this moment. I watched Farrow hold her position through all 4 days without ever raising her voice, without ever resorting to threats beyond the simple, quiet reminder that Kessler-Ome would continue exactly as it had for the past 5 months if no agreement was reached. She didn't need to threaten anything more dramatic than that. The Council delegation understood exactly what continuation meant, better than anyone, because they had spent 5 months watching it unfold in real time. On the 4th day, they agreed to the terms, with modifications that would extend the renegotiation period across several years rather than happening all at once, a compromise Farrow accepted after consulting quietly with the rest of our delegation, myself included. Gradual change that actually holds is worth more than sudden change that collapses the moment pressure eases, she told me privately, during a brief recess before the final signing. We're not trying to break their entire system apart overnight. We're trying to make sure it can never again be used the way it was used against Elena. The formal ceasefire agreement was signed on the final day, in a quiet ceremony, far less dramatic than the execution broadcast that had started everything 5 months earlier. There were no crowds, no elaborate staging, just a small group of representatives from both sides, along with observers from 3 of the newly independent systems who had specifically requested to witness the signing. I stood near the back of the room during the ceremony, thinking about Elena kneeling on that marble floor, looking into the camera with an expression I now understood far better than I had 5 months earlier. She hadn't been afraid in that final moment because she'd already made peace with the possibility that her death might be the exact thing that finally forced this conversation to happen. Not out of some desire for martyrdom, but out of a genuine, careful calculation that the door she was opening was worth whatever it cost her personally to open it. After the signing, Pharaoh addressed the small gathered crowd, her tone measured as always, but carrying something I hadn't heard from her before, something close to quiet satisfaction rather than grim determination. "This agreement does not erase what happened 5 months ago," she said. "It does not undo the loss of a woman who deserved far better from the galaxy she was trying to build a place for us within. What it does is ensure that her loss meant something beyond grief. It means, going forward, that species too small to defend themselves against unchecked power will have somewhere to turn that isn't simply hoping the powerful choose mercy on their own." I thought about Lena Osei, recovering from a fractured arm in the medical bay months earlier, asking me a question I still hadn't fully answered even now. I thought about the outpost personnel who had evacuated before our strikes, given a chance to walk away that Elena herself had never been given. I thought about the 7 systems, soon to be more, who had reached out not because Earth demanded their loyalty, but because we had offered something the Council never had: the simple willingness to listen without requiring submission first. None of it felt like victory exactly. Victory implied an ending, a clean resolution where the difficult work was finished and everyone could finally rest. This didn't feel like that. It felt like the beginning of a much longer, much harder process, one that would require the same careful patience Elena had shown throughout her entire career, applied now not just to negotiations with the Council, but to the far more difficult work of building something genuinely better in its place. I returned to the Meridian 2 weeks after the ceasefire, resuming my post under Captain Blake as our task force shifted from active strikes to something new, something the briefings were now calling stabilization operations, helping the newly independent systems establish their own security and trade arrangements without Council interference, without simply becoming dependent on Earth instead. It was slower work, less dramatic than the operations that had defined my first months in the field, but it felt, in its own way, more important. I spent long hours in meetings with local representatives from systems that had spent generations under Council enforcement, listening to concerns about everything from trade logistics to basic self-governance, trying to offer guidance without ever overstepping into the same kind of control we had just spent 5 months fighting to dismantle. 6 months after the ceasefire, I received a message from General Nair, now overseeing the broader transition effort from Earth, informing me that the Independent Review Tribunal promised in the ceasefire agreement had officially convened for the first time, seated with representatives from 11 different species, none of them from Council leadership, tasked specifically with reviewing any future accusations brought against member envoys before punishment of any kind could be enacted. It wasn't a perfect system. I doubted anything built this quickly, in the aftermath of something as painful as what had happened to Elena, ever could be perfect. But it was something that hadn't existed 6 months earlier, something that meant the next envoy from any species, human or otherwise, facing accusations from a body far more powerful than themselves, would have somewhere to turn beyond simply hoping for mercy. I still think about Elena often, especially during the quiet moments aboard the Meridian, staring out at whatever unfamiliar star system we happened to be stationed near that particular week. I think about the calm certainty in her voice during that final recorded message, the way she refused to let fear or anger reshape a plan built on careful reasoning. I think about the 7th clause, the one detail she made sure Nair understood exactly as intended: proof that even in her final hours, she was still thinking clearly about what would actually help the people who came after her, rather than simply what might ease the pain of the moment. Humanity didn't win this fight because we were the strongest species in the galaxy. We weren't. Not by a wide margin, not in raw military power or technological advancement or sheer numbers. We won because we understood something about ourselves that the Council never managed to understand about us. The simple fact that a species built on stubborn, scattered independence could absorb blows that would have shattered a more centralized power and keep moving forward anyway. But understanding why we survived isn't the same as understanding what we're supposed to do with that survival now. That question follows me through every stabilization meeting, every cautious new alliance, every small system finally learning what it feels like to make its own choices after generations of being told those choices belong to someone else. Elena believed the attempt was always worth making, even facing the worst possible outcome. I think about that belief now, every single day, as I try to help build whatever comes next out of the door her death forced open. Not a perfect galaxy. Not a fully healed one. Just one, slowly, carefully, given an honest chance to become something better than the fear it had been built on before. That is the part of this story that never really ends, and I suspect it never fully will. Some doors, once opened, simply require someone to keep walking through them, one careful step at a time, for as long as it takes, to reach whatever lies on the other side. I intend to keep walking. I think, in her own way, Elena would have wanted exactly that.